Hi there, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time it is. As always, happy whatever day it is you're watching this. Welcome to Left Side of the Aisle. I'm Larry Erickson, your host, and for about the next almost half hour, I'm going to be talking about some things I think you should know about and perhaps do something about. If you have any reactions to the show, you can send them to me directly. My personal email, whoviating, WHOVIATING at AOL.com. Or you can go to my website, which is called Lotus Surviving a Dark Time. You can get the email address from there if you didn't catch it, or you can leave a comment there if you prefer. In any event, if you do send me email, please include something in the subject line and make it clear this is not spam. I get way too much of that, as we all do. And be a little patient about getting an answer, because I'm actually really not very good about dealing with email. But it is a promise, you will get an answer. All right, with that, we're going to get started. We're going to start with, as I always like to, with some good news. And this is a little bit tempered good news, and it's going to require some explanation, so bear with me. The good news is that on Friday, January 16th, Attorney General Eric Holder announced he was sharply curtailing federal participation in a program under which cops can seize personal property based on their suspicion, and suspicion is not actually based on anything concrete or clearly provable, but more like it sounds good to me, so whatever. But police can seize property based on their suspicions. You may not have heard of this program before. If you haven't, it's time that you did. It is a corrupted and corruption-ridden outgrowth of that abysmal failure called the war on drugs. The program is called civil forfeiture, civil asset forfeiture, and allows cops to seize assets based on nothing more than their belief. And again, I emphasize that it's not proof, it's their belief that the assets were involved in or were purchased with the proceeds of illegal drug activity or illegal other activity. They can do this even if they have no basis for any charges against the person whose property it was. And no, I am not exaggerating, not one tiny bit. Under this program, cops have seized money, computers, TV, jewelry, cars, even homes and businesses without ever presenting or even having to present a single shred of evidence that the owners of those properties had ever done anything illegal. And once an asset is seized, it becomes the responsibility, the obligation of the person whose property was taken, to prove that this property was not in any way connected to illegal activity. That is, they have to prove a negative, and they have the burden of proof in doing it. And remember, this is a civil matter. It's not a criminal one. You have no right to an attorney. You have to bear any legal costs out of your own pocket. Legal costs that can easily mount into thousands of dollars, well beyond the value of the assets seized, so that most people just give up and don't even try to get their stuff back. Civil forfeiture is not new. In fact, its practice by the King of England was one of the things that drove the American Revolution. And it actually was what was behind the clause of the Fourth Amendment of people being guaranteed against unreasonable seizure of their property, and the guarantee in the Fifth Amendment against property being taken without due process of law. And beyond limited cases, such as piracy was an example, beyond limited cases like that, civil asset forfeiture was not widely used in the United States until 1984. That's when Congress passed the Comprehensive Crime Control Act. Until then, the value of the assets seized under this civil asset forfeiture went into the general fund. But this law established a special fund that turned over the proceeds from such seizures to the law enforcement agencies responsible for them. That is, basically, it went to the cops and the prosecutors, which meant, putting it another way, the cops now had a profit motive in seizing property. The result of this? At the Justice Department, proceeds from civil asset forfeiture went from $27 million in 1985 to $556 million in 1993 to $4.2 billion in 2012. The horror stories related to this forfeiture program are endless. A driver in Texas is stopped for driving too close to the white line. The cops took the $3,900 he had with him and his car based on a claim of the odor of burned marijuana. No drugs were found in the car. He was told, don't even bother getting a lawyer. The money always stays here anyway. A man is busted for selling $20 worth of pot to an informant. Philadelphia cops moved to seize the house where his parents live on the grounds that the sale took place on that property. Federal officials moved to seize a family-run motel because they alleged that several times over the preceding 15 years, some guests had dealt drugs from some of its rooms. No claim was made that the owners or any of their staff were in any way involved with this. And get this now, local authorities were tipped to this property by a federal agent whose primary job it is to identify properties for seizure. Since 1984, most, if not all, states have adopted their own civil forfeiture laws, but most of those come with standards clearly stricter than the federal ones. Standards involve, for example, being able to show that there's actually a connection between this property and some illegal activity. But there is a huge loophole that remained. A federal program called, creepily enough, Equitable Sharing. This program, the feds could adopt seizures made by state and local authorities, which thereby could be justified under the looser federal guidelines instead of the stricter state ones. The feds would keep 20% of the proceeds, 80% would go to the local police departments and the drug task forces, again, not to the general fund. Since 2008, thousands of local and state police agencies have made more than 55,000 seizures under this law, a total of property worth $3 billion. And in fact, there are programs across the country that are instructing local cops in how to use civil asset forfeiture in order to fatten their departmental budgets. One such program described a house to be seized as a gold mine. Another described cops literally drooling over the possibility of grabbing a BMW. In a program in New Jersey, Mercer, New Jersey County Prosecutor Sean McMurdy said civil seizure is about, quoting him, cash or assets that can be utilized by law enforcement, motor vehicles, computers, flat screens. He continued that we're not interested in taking a charter from a company as forfeited asset because it doesn't have any monetary value to law enforcement. He also told the cops, when in doubt, take it. Because worst case scenario, we can always give it back. A worst case scenario, he hastened to add, which almost never arises. And what's more, it's not true it's not true that the only thing that's involved is assets that are can be utilized by law enforcement in investigating, pursuing crimes, unless you include things like paying for bonuses and parties and buying everything from popcorn machines to boats to fit under that description. And here's something important to know. Massachusetts is not immune to this. A newspaper investigation a couple of years ago revealed that over the past several years, Massachusetts cops and prosecutors have seized tens of millions of dollars of personal property via civil forfeiture. Middlesex County officials, for example, seize not only cash, cars, and bank accounts, they seize cell phones, computers, an engagement ring, GPS devices, and lottery scratch tickets. The county DA described whether or not to seize an asset as, quoting, a business decision, unquote. Meanwhile, among the other law enforcement purposes on which Worcester County spent money it obtained by seizures included bottled water, attendance at conferences, tree trimming services, and the purchase of a Zamboni, which, if you don't know what that is, that's the machine that smooths ice at skating rinks and at ice hockey rinks. All of which brings us back, finally, to the good news. What Holder has announced is that equitable sharing is being mostly shut down, and federal agencies will no longer be able to adopt seizures unless the property includes firearms, ammunition, explosives, child pornography, or other materials directly concerning public safety. What that means is, though, even though local cops can still pursue civil asset forfeiture under their state laws, they'll now have to justify them under those state laws, which are, again, significantly stricter, for the most part, than are the federal laws. The howling that has started to come from some quarters about Holder's decision proves, in fact, the importance of this move. Now, it does have a limitation beyond those I just mentioned. It does not apply to joint state and federal operations. Now, if this only applies to actual on-the-ground interagency cooperation, then it really doesn't matter a whole lot. But, well, here's the thing is, words we have already learned can be very slippery things. Don't forget, it was our own Mr. H here who a couple of years ago defended the extrajudicial killing of American citizens on the grounds that, quoting him, due process and judicial process are not the same thing, and argued that the Constitution only promises due process, and that if the executive branch on its own in an unreviewable decision decides that some American is a terrorist to be killed, that's due process. So the shadow that's being cast over Holder's decision refers again to joint operations. And again, if that's actual joint operations, fine. But if it includes the hundreds of federally funded local anti-drug task forces on the grounds that those task forces have a federal liaison, then you've got a loophole big enough to drive several truckloads of seized property through. So actually, it remains to be clarified. But for the moment, I tell you what, let's take it at face value and call it a solid step toward ending the whole corrupt and corrupting practice of civil asset forfeiture, one that, frankly, I don't see how it cannot be regarded as blatantly unconstitutional. That solid step that Holder has taken is good news. Or next up, I have a couple of updates about things I've talked about in the past. For one, I've talked several times about the minimum wage and raising the minimum wage, so I just wanted to include this quick update. New York Governor Andrew Cuomo has announced that he plans to submit to the New York State Legislature a proposal to raise the minimum wage in New York from $11.50 an hour to $11.50 an hour in New York City and $10.50 an hour in the rest of the state. He initially had opposed the idea of different cities being able to set different minimum wages, but apparently has finally been persuaded by the reality that it's just a lot more expensive to live in New York than it is to live in other parts of the state. The minimum wage in New York is now $8.75 an hour. It's going to be rising to $9 an hour by the end of the year. Now, the Working Families Party applauded the proposal, but also expressed disappointment that Cuomo has now backed off the $13 an hour minimum wage that he endorsed last spring. But then again, last spring was when he was trying to get the endorsement of the Working Families Party, so you know how that goes. All right, another update. I said last week that by the time you saw last week's show, the Supreme Court might have decided to take up the issue of same-sex marriage. Well, they did, and they have. They decided to take up the 6th Federal Circuit Court of Appeals decision, which upheld the bans on same-sex marriage. They're consolidating 4 cases from various states in that circuit. And the court said it will consider two questions. One, the right of people, same-sex couples, to get married, and the obligation of states to recognize same-sex marriages that were performed in other states where they are legal. An unusually long time is going to be allowed for oral arguments on each of those issues, and a decision, the oral arguments are in April, a decision is expected by June. Justice Anthony Kennedy is likely to be the key figure in the case. He's a generally conservative jurist, but he's authored several decisions that were in favor of LGBT rights. And I think at this point, most people expect a 5-4 decision out of the Supreme Court upholding same-sex marriage. And that's not a given, of course, and one possibility is a move to split the difference by saying that states do not have to allow same-sex marriage, but they do have to recognize such marriages performed in states where they are legal. And I'm actually going to throw this out. I have to say that personally, I'm with those who think there's going to be a 5-4 vote on this. But because the four moderates on the court are safe yes votes. Kennedy is a pretty safe vote. But I'm also going to raise another possibility that it may surprise everybody and actually, instead of being 5-4, being 6-3, with the sixth vote being that of John Roberts, who is certainly conservative, but I think Roberts is also showing some concern about the historical legacy of the Roberts Court, how the Roberts Court will look 40 or 50 years from now. And I think he is not particularly interested in having his court wind up on the wrong side of history on a matter like this. So anyway, I'm just throwing that out. But for now, what we're going to do is we're going to take a break. And we're back. I actually have two footnotes about, just talking about same-sex marriage in the Supreme Court. I've got two footnotes to that bit of news. The first is that, hilariously, the American Family Association is demanding that Elena Kagan and Ruth Bader Ginsburg recuse themselves from the marriage equality cases. Why? Because they have opinions on the matter. They have been partial to same-sex marriage in their rulings, which is a really odd basis to say they should recuse themselves. Oh, but they've advocated for it outside of the courtroom. Okay, except that Supreme Court justices are allowed to do that the same way any other citizen does. The president of the American Family Association, Tim Wildman, says, quoting, "Congress has directed that federal judicial officers must disqualify themselves from hearing cases in specified circumstances," which is true. None of those circumstances apply here. As a poster at Daily Kos said, what was once a maliciously aggressive adversary against equality has been reduced to a quivery ooze of despair. And that's a lovely sight to see. On our other footnote, again, a bit of amusement, a little more bitter amusement this time, but a bit of amusement. There's a New York Times article that suggested that a Supreme Court victory for same-sex marriage could be really good news for Republicans. This is because it would, quoting the paper, have the benefit of largely neutralizing a debate that a majority of Americans believe Republicans are on the wrong side of and well ahead of the party's 2016 presidential primaries. That's because they say those candidates in those primaries could have a political escape hatch about same-sex marriage by saying, "It's been settled, let's move on," which, of course, the right wing never did about gun control in the several decades preceding the Heller decision, and which they still haven't done in the 42 years since Roe v. Wade. But, apparently, according to the paper, they'll be able to do that and get away with that here. And what I find amusing here is that no matter what the issue, no matter how things fall out, loss, victory, indecision, whatever it is, you will find somebody in the mainstream media explaining to you how this is good news for the right wing. It really just gets very silly. Speaking of silly, next up is one of our regular weekly features. It's the Clown Award, given as always for meritorious stupidity. Now, I was going to give the Clown Award this week to former Representative Joe Walsh for his tweet about the Charlie Hebdo cartoons. He said, quoting, "Let's hope that when the Islamists next strike, they first behead the appeasing cowards at CNN, MSNBC, et al. Who refuse to show the cartoons." He later tried to clarify, saying, no, he's not hoping for another attack, but he knows that one will come. And when it does, apparently, he hopes that they will first kill the people at CNN, MSNBC, and other outfits that made editorial decisions of which he disapproves. I was also going to give the Clown Award to Jamie Dimon, the CEO of J.P. Morgan Chase, the nation's largest bank, who whined that banks are under assault from federal regulators because you used to deal with one or two regulators and now you have to deal with 5 or 6, which is, he says, unfair and quite possibly un-American. This was while he was announcing a record year for his bank, including earnings of $4.9 billion in the fourth quarter. But those guys got outclassed. They got outclassed. So this week, the big red nose goes to Fox News host Jeanine Pirro, who recently unleashed a truly out-of-her-skull 7-minute rant about how we have to kill every radical Muslim. In fact, her very first words were, quoting exactly, "We have to kill them, we have to kill them." Apparently, we're supposed to do this by arming other Muslims who can be trusted, apparently, to ruthlessly kill those radicals and only kill the people that we want killed. Considering how well this has worked in places like Afghanistan and Iraq, hey, what could possibly go wrong? Among other points in this brain-dead diatribe, she called Pakistan an Arab state, which it isn't, and apparently she doesn't know the difference between Arab and Muslim. She claimed there's a reverse crusade, which, considering how well the Crusades actually worked out for Europeans, I don't see why she's worried about that. She expressed shock that Muslims have been invited to worship at our national cathedral, because apparently no Muslim can be an American citizen. She predicted efforts to limit our First Amendment rights in order to comply with Sharia law, and I can't even come up with a good sarcastic response to that one. And she claimed the fanatics have conquered us through immigration and interfaith dialogue. At one point, she declaimed, "Are we morons?" Not us, kiddo. Fox News host Jeanine Pirro, a moron and a clown. And that brings us to our other regular weekly feature. It's the outrage of the week. There doubtless were sighs of relief throughout the American intelligence community when on January 15th, the National Research Council declared that there is no viable technological alternative to bulk collection of data by the National Security Agency. Bulk collection, of course, referring to massive sweeping up of telephone metadata, internet communications, and all the rest of our personal information and conversations that the spooks swallow up in their conscious attempt to strip away every bit of privacy we have. All of it done, of course, in the name of making us safe. The report was commissioned last January by the President's most transparent administration ever in the wake of revelations by Edward Snowden that the government routinely sucked up information about the day, time, length, and location of telephone calls by tens of millions of ordinary Americans not suspected of any wrongdoing. Is there, the National Research Council was asked, a better way to do this than bulk collection? Their conclusion? Sorry, folks, no better way to do it. Bulk collection is the only way, gotta be this way, so take that, Mr. Ms. Privacy Advocate. We're protecting you the best way we can. Except, and this is where the outrage starts to creep in, here is the first sentence of the Washington Post article on this. Note the last phrase, quoting, "A committee of scientific experts has concluded that there is no viable technological alternative to bulk collection of data by the National Security Agency that allows analysts access to communications whose significance only becomes clear years later." Got it? They weren't asked if there's an alternative to bulk collection to better track actual terrorists or actually suspected terrorists. They were not asked if there was a better way to pursue legitimate investigations. They were asked if there was a different way, a better way, to gather information for which you have no present use, but might at some point in the future become useful in a way that you don't even know about yet. Is there a better way to do that than collecting all of that data? Quoting the report, if past events become interesting in the present because of new circumstances, historical events and the data they provide will be available for analysis only if they were previously collected. In other words, you can't have the information if you didn't gather the information. I wonder why it took them since January to figure that out, and it does suggest to me that they spent more time examining pina coladas than technological capabilities. But let's be fair to the National Research Council. It investigated what it was asked to investigate. The scope of the investigation was determined by James Clapper, director of the Office of the Directorate of National Intelligence, who indisputably flat out lied to Congress about the very existence of the metadata program back in 2013. And that scope that the NRC was supposed to follow did not include any consideration of privacy issues or the intelligence impact of eliminating this kind of bulk collection, which is probably understandable because previously a panel appointed by Obama said that bulk data collection should be shut down, and a report a year ago by the Privacy and Civil Liberties Oversight Board said it could not find a single instance in which the telephone records program either made a concrete difference in the outcome of a counterterrorism investigation or contributed to the discovery of a previously unknown plot. So now we're actually being treated to a rehash of the no alternative bull, the vital important nonsense, and it's the dangerous world fear-mongering, because the spooks apparently not only get to spy on us, they get to decide what questions are asked about that spying. And this time, the third time was the charm. And that is an outrage. Finally, very quickly, one of our occasional features, it's everything you need to know, where you can learn an awful lot about something in a very short time. And this, in the wake of all of Obama's happy talk about the economy at the State of the Union address, this is everything you need to know about the real state of the economy in one sentence. According to a new analysis from the Southern Education Foundation, for the first time, more than half of U.S. public school students live in low-income households. That's it for this week. We're done. We're out of here. We'll see you next week. Have the best week you possibly can. Peace.